little video on the gang origins. I'm not going to get into specific gangs exactly. I mean, I may mention them here and there, but essentially what I'm going to do is kind of explain to you why gangs even exist. I'm not going to talk about organized crime because there is a difference between organized crime and gangs, even though gangs basically kind of copied off of organized crime. So, um, what I want to do though is kind of give you a little bit more of the historical perspective. So, and yes, um, this is a Word file that I had, and it's actually, the more I look at it, like, yeah, it's kind of it. Well, it lacks. Let's put it that way. It's lacking in what I wanted to discuss, in greater detail. But it is something that I had come up with. It's a little older, but I can still use it to kind of as a reference. So, all right. So all gangs basically start in a similar fashion, but I will say here in America, um, there are two different, if you want to call it, groups of gangs that have different reasons for starting. I mean, there are similar backgrounds, but different components to it. So I'm going to start on the East Coast and talk about how that really happened. So essentially, the East Coast, it goes all the way back to when people, when we were still a young country, and anytime we had a group that was established, so we were primarily an English settlement, right? So, what happened was most of the people who were coming over here were English, who'd been living here multiple generations, etc. Were English. Okay. However, when you started seeing other groups, especially like the first group that was kind of looked down upon or viewed negatively, were the Irish, because obviously English and Irish have always had some issues. But you had the Irish that underwent some issues, discrimination, wouldn't be hired for jobs because they were Irish. And ultimately that led to, and it's basically comes down to job opportunities, is essentially what it originally started as. Now, in order to protect fellow Irishmen, they would create these guilds, which guilds go way back to medieval times. But it's almost like today's modern version of unions. So what they would do is they would form these guilds, and eventually these guilds would, if necessary, or there's enough tension between, say, the different guilds from the Irish groups and the English groups, then they would actually have, you and I would call it gang violence. Whether it be a harming of each other, harming of the stores, businesses that the other groups would have, or even if you've watched Gangs of New York, the movie, it's essentially telling that same story. But what I'm getting at is that's where the idea of gangs, or some idea of, quote, protection, comes from. But you'll see that in Irish. You'll see it throughout history on, once again, the East Coast primarily. You see it go from Irish to Italians to basically whoever the next group up was. So, eventually went through the Eastern Bloc, those particular immigrants. So all the way through, that's where you are seeing each group basically feels, whether it be because difference in languages, difference in cultures, difference in looks, whatever the case is, they felt like they were being, and sometimes they were discriminated against, or they felt like they were, and they needed protection, just like the ones who considered themselves natives here said, well, we need to defend ourselves from these other people coming in and taking our jobs, our opportunities, whatever. So that's all gangs comes down to. Okay, essentially that's it. And then eventually that idea of jobs and money translated or changed into potential money, power, and things like that through drugs, people, cash itself. Okay, So now let's go to the West Coast, and I'll explain a little bit about that, how it's a little different. Is that, yes, this is nothing new. This whole idea of workers coming in up from, say, Mexico, that's where a lot of the gangs actually got their start, is because there were lower income jobs that were performed by either some white but primarily black workers. And when the Hispanic population came up, they would do the same job for less money. So the black community basically felt like, oh, well, we're losing our jobs, and the only way that we can keep our jobs is to basically unite, much like I described happening on the East Coast, except a lot of it was the whites pretty much stayed out of it on the West Coast. It was primarily blacks and Hispanics that separated into guilds based on race. Honestly, that's all it really was, race or ethnicity. And so all over who was going to get the smaller jobs of whether it be picking different types of work on farms or orchards or other jobs. As time went on, it was other jobs too, but nonetheless, that's where gangs actually originated, why they originated here in the US. So let's see here. I'm trying to think anything I didn't cover. Oh, I do know something that, so originally, going back down here, you guys can see this growth here. What led to the growth of gangs, and ultimately, why did they morph or evolve into what we see today? For instance, gangs originally were not in the drug sale. They weren't in the drug game at all to begin with. Essentially, those people who were dealing drugs, selling drugs here in the U.S., other illegal activities, they wanted protection, like physical protection. So basically, these gangs who were originally set up to provide both job and physical protection for people of their group or their neighborhood. Okay, they said, well, we basically are providing a form of protection even to businesses in the area. So we can provide it for, these people who are, even those who are drug dealers. Okay, so they do that. After a while, they realize we are providing protection. We're putting ourselves at risk or at more risk. And the people who are actually selling drugs are the ones making more money. We're not getting much of this money that's made. So they basically thought, well, why do we need to be take the brunt of it, or the workers and not get paid, when we can just do the drug sales ourselves? So that's where essentially drugs became now it's considered to be just a part of gangs. That's just what gangs do. That's where it came in, because they got tired of getting the small amount of pay or a small percentage of what was being made, when they could actually have all of it and provide the security without actually having to pay anybody. I mean, they are the security. It's kind of the way they viewed it. So that's how it morphed into gangs getting into drugs. And, like new members anymore, besides the way I've discussed in our other feedback, sometimes it's based on generations, meaning, if I'm a gang member and I have a child, I basically, unless I am an enlightened gang member and decide it's not a good idea, most of them will assume or want their families to continue that same trend or tradition, lack of better terms. And then throughout history, you actually have, as you can see here, Vietnam. Post-Vietnam was actually a point in time when there was a big boom in gang numbers. Okay, the reason for that is you have soldiers who are coming back without really anything to do in terms of, at that point in time, they may not have had a skills or skill sets, and they didn't have places that were looking to hire veterans like a lot of places do now. So they didn't have skill sets for most other jobs. They some of them had some other issues that made them much more difficult to employ. But then also, they're just like I said, there weren't as many opportunities for them to get work. So gangs look at it and say, hey, this is by the way where guns and other more dangerous weapons get kind of thrown into gangs themselves. Originally, gangs were basically fist fights, knives, clubs, or anything along those lines. They're basically handheld weapons, not or hand-to-hand type of combat type of things that were going on. But then after Vietnam, they saw these people who had these qualities and had access to weapons. So yes, they because at that point in time they were still allowed to. Once you left the military, you could still take some of your stuff with you. For one, either they would allow you to, or two, you could kind of sneak it out and no one was going to say much. But this is where these gangs become armed, because you have individuals who either have weapons and weapons training, or at least can get access to these, the guns, or even sometimes explosives, etc. But mostly guns is what we're talking about. And also some of them, during the war, also got addicted to heroin and some other drugs. So it was an easier time for gangs to basically pick these people and make them feel like they were valuable in some way. So, and then down here it says reasons for violence. A lot of it can be race-based. Some people out there, which is crazy, think that only whites can be racist, which is entirely inaccurate. You can be racist regardless of what race someone is from. They can be racist. You have white supremacists, you have black supremacists, you have, you name it, Hispanic, Asian, etc., who believe that their race is superior or whatever. It's just the way that some people are, and some people the way they're raised. It can be over turf, in essence, and the reason why we worry about turf, the more turf or area you cover, the more power you yield, or wield, I should say. The more power you wield, and also the more money you can make from drug sales or other illegal business opportunities. You can extort money. That's another way that gangs started to do. They started to extort different businesses in their area. So not only were they originally providing protection, but then that protection came through extortion methods. So yeah, we'll protect your business, but if you don't support us or don't help us, we'll burn it down. So take your pick. So, and then obviously drugs and money. If you can get power, money, or anything like that, that's essentially why there's so much violence between the different gangs. So something else I did want to point out that I'd almost forgot, and it's actually really interesting, is going back to the whole protection for workers and things like that. We've been going through a period now for a while where everybody's saying, or not everybody, but you hear people say, oh, we need to increase minimum wage, or you hear politicians say that, whether it be Bernie Sanders, whether it be other, mostly Democrats. I'm not saying no Republicans say, but it's mostly a liberal viewpoint. But the ironic part is the reason why those, going way back into history, the reason why they would have those wage increases, or throughout history they've increased minimum wage as a way to prevent whatever race or group was coming in and taking those jobs. So basically, if you want to say it from the West Coast with the blacks and Hispanics, it would be the blacks' way of keeping Hispanics from taking the lower wage jobs, because the blacks wouldn't take those lower wage jobs if they weren't getting paid a certain amount. So that's essentially what it is. It's by saying we're going to increase the wage so that those who are a part of the bigger group will be willing to work, whereas those who are wanting to come in and, quote, invading into our space won't be able to get those jobs, because we're finally the other people were willing to take them. So that's something else I just want to point out. It's kind of interesting. So, all right. I'm pretty close on limit, so I will talk to you later. Have a great day.